I wanted to be really conscious of not just bringing more women and gender expansive voices into the conversation, but also really highlighting folks who were doing things differently, who held different roles, and who perhaps were prioritizing values like interconnectedness and gratitude and humility and care and all of these qualities that we perhaps had not seen so prioritized in some of those dominant climate conversations.
My name's Michelle Grant, and welcome to the Grateful Podcast. It's really great to have you here as we chat with women all around the world who are working to build more just, generative, and even joyful food systems, communities, and lives. And today we're picking up a central topic in this work, and that's the topic of climate resilience. So this episode, I'm really pleased to be joined by Kylie Flanagan, who is the author of a book that's just been released. Her book is called Climate Resilience: How We Can Keep Each Other Safe, Care for Our Communities, and Fight Back Against Climate Change. And this book is really an extension of Kylie's work as a climate communicator, as the executive director of a small climate justice focused foundation. She graduated from Dartmouth College and received her master's in sustainability solutions from Presidio Graduate School. Now, I don't know about you, but I know I've seen so many climate related books in the last few years, which is certainly a good thing, but not too many of them that take a lens and an angle that Kylie's taken with her book. And in fact, she actually shared with me that that's one of the things that prompted her to write this particular book. She felt like every book she was picking up about climate change that was coming out were more often than not written by people who didn't really represent the grassroots climate movements that she was connected to and that she was inspired by with her work. And so in her book, she actually shares the story of 39 different individuals who have all been cultivating resilience for decades. And she sits down with them to explore this central question of how might we truly address the roots of the climate crisis? And how can we keep each other safe in the years to come while making sure that no one gets left behind? And as you might have already noticed in the title, that idea of keeping each other safe, caring for one another, is really central to what Kylie unpacks in her book with these 39 co-authors that she's invited into the process. So this book really asks us to listen to those who are the most impacted by climate change and also who know what they're doing. So she centered the voices of Native rights activists, queer ecologists, Gen Z organizers, urban farmers, and others on the front lines to hear from them. What are the strategies that they're implementing to advance climate change mitigation and adaptation, but as importantly, to weave that together with social justice at the same time? Before we dive into my chat with Kylie, I just wanted to read you an excerpt from her book that's from a conversation she had with Reverend Mariama White Hammond, who's Boston's Chief of Environment, Energy and Open Spaces. I think this just gives you a really nice feeling for the angle and the tone of the book. And this is what Mariama has to say. Begin quote. I'm overwhelmed by the immensity of the challenge, but I've also come to understand that if we have to make a radical shift, we also have the opportunity to rebuild the world better than it is, not just to try to survive a catastrophe, but to actively create something worth laying it all on the line for. For me, it's not worth laying it all on the line just to get to 350 parts per million of global atmospheric carbon dioxide. This moment is about a fundamental reorientation of our relationships. When people ask me what I do, I say that I do ecological justice work rather than climate justice or environmental justice, because eco means home. And we've got dysfunction in our home. We need to shift how we are relating to other humans and how we relate to all other beings on whom our lives depend. Right now, our relationships are abusive and destructive. Quite frankly, when you look at humanity from the perspective of other living beings on this planet, we don't really deserve to be here. We're a hot mess. We don't know how to act. We're the worst house guests ever. Our work is to bring justice to the relationships in this home. And as far as I'm concerned, despite what folks like Elon Musk may argue, we only have one home. Therefore, climate work is first and foremost spiritual work. Technocratic fixes can't address the way we relate to each other, to the earth, and other species on this planet. Our relationships are the source of our problem. I'm not anti-technology, but I'm frustrated by people who believe that technology will save us. We have to change. Technology may assist us in our reorientation, but if we can believe that we can just find technologies that allow us to live the same but with a lower carbon footprint, that, in my opinion, is a pipe dream. We're staring down the biggest evolutionary shift for humanity ever. I do believe it's within us to be better. I do believe that we want to be better in the depths of our hearts. And I know that in moments of history, enough of us have become our best selves to allow major shifts to happen. End quote. So with that backdrop set, let's hear more from Kylie about what actually led her to write this book in the first place, what changed for her in the writing process, what shifted personally, but also how she views this topic of climate change, and what she hopes readers and listeners take away to empower themselves on their own climate journey. I really enjoyed reading your bio at the start of the book because it says, Kylie has dabbled in goat midwifery, cheese making, tiny house architecture, supper club hosting, edible landscaping, and sustainable business consulting, always driven by a desire to make the world a more delicious, beautiful, joyous, and just place. So I really love this for many reasons, but especially because I have also a random interest in goats and tiny houses. So I thought we could dig in there a little bit. And if you could tell me more about what it was like to be a goat midwife.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. Yes. And first of all, I love that those are shared interests because they are niche. Yeah, so both were tremendous experiences and also major learning opportunities for myself. So I started working on the goat farm after college. And not unlike yourself, I believe, I had been really interested in food systems and food justice throughout school. I just felt like this really rich, exciting, delicious space where so many of my interests and passions collided. And after studying food issues for many years, I left really craving firsthand experience within the food system. And so I ended up at this super idyllic, dreamy goat farm in southern Vermont, which is not far from where I had gone to college. And I would spend my days herding the goats around to different pastures on the hillside. I'd milk them twice a day. We'd make cheese and wrap goat milk caramels, which we'd sell at the farmer's market. And in the springtime, I helped deliver the baby goats, which was a super special experience. One of my tasks during kidding season was literally to cuddle baby goats to acclimate them to humans. So it was, oh my gosh, a dream. I would go to bed each night just absolutely giddy to do it all again the next day. And it was also really humbling. I was not great at most of this work. It was so new to me and so different from what I'd been trained for in school. I think it probably took double the amount of time to milk the goats for me as it should have. But it was overall really rewarding, and it felt like such a privilege to be able to spend my day deepening my relationship with the land and plants and animals around me. And goats are so awesome. I was really lucky, though, to be at a farm that gave me a place to live and paid me a decent wage and had me work manageable hours. And, it was hard work, but it was doable. The farm owners were really savvy to build their business model around a novelty value-added good like goat milk caramels rather than just goat milk or even goat cheese, which had such set market prices, because it allowed them to survive financially and it gave them a little more financial wiggle room to do things in a way that aligned with their values, like take good care of their goats and their workers. And from talking with other vendors at the farmers market and coworkers who came from other farm gigs, pigs, I came to realize that my experience was pretty rare. There are so many incredible small farms in that area and all over the world, obviously, that are just barely scraping by. And I remember chatting with the vendor next to me at the farmer's market who said that they were working 70 hours a week and were lucky if they netted $12 in a week. So one of my biggest takeaways from working in that space was just how deeply undervalued food and farm labor is, particularly as a small farm and as a small farm committed to certain environmental standards and ethics. It is so hard to make it work within the current food system. And growing and creating food can be such sacred and life-affirming and joyful work. And it can also be backbreaking and brutal and thankless, and sometimes all of that at once. So it made me so appreciative of the folks who are working hard to ensure that food and farm workers are appropriately valued and appreciated, and that the work is decent and humane. We're all involved. And Michelle, I know you've been deeply immersed in this work.
Yeah, well, I've never had the joy of nursing baby goats. It would be definitely on my job dream list. But absolutely, I mean, whenever I've had the chance to work on a farm or with farmers, it just highlights so strongly the underlying challenge in the system, which is this inequality of where value is distributed and the disconnect that we all have from who's actually doing the labor and putting in the resources and taking all the risk to get food on our plate. And they're often the ones that then can't afford, healthy food for themselves and their families. So yeah, I really get that. So all of these diverse experiences have come together and taken you down this road of climate resilience as a focus. It's the focus of your book. It's the focus of your work as a director of a climate justice not-for-profit. So aside from the goats and the tiny houses, what else in your personal experience nudged you down this path to climate resilience?
So, I think I've been in the climate space loosely since I was probably around 14. And I got really interested in climate and environmental work or spaces, I think in part because it just felt like such major challenges that I felt, compelled to get involved. But I think on a more personal level, I was really interested in the justice and public health aspects because I grew up in a county with some of the highest breast cancer rates in the country. And I knew of several different cancer clusters at other schools. And so there were a lot of conversations around industrial pollution, around toxic pesticides, around other things that could potentially be making our community members sick. And so that was sort of my entryway into the movement. And then my journey in the climate space really has been a circuitous one. I've been in a lot of different kind of movement spaces and occupied a lot of different roles. But I think I got a lot more interested in climate resilience specifically in the past few years after living through several wildfire seasons in Northern California. And, I remember just feeling like so many of the spaces that I was in were so focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is obviously foundational to all of this work. And at the same time, I remember thinking, okay, that's not enough. How are we going to keep one another safe in this moment? Because the climate crisis is here and it's continuing to intensify. And there were some spaces that were really focused on climate adaptation, but that too just didn't feel quite right. It was oftentimes adaptation sacrificing some justice issues. And so I remember just thinking as I was at home for weeks at a time, just hiding out from the smoke, just feeling just how precious this moment is in reorienting, because there is kind of one path that's a little bit more business as usual, where folks who have the financial resources to do so will do what they need to do to make climate impacts and climate disasters more of an inconvenience. Folks who are equipped to do so will get air conditioners and backup power generators and better air filters and will put their homes on stilts and all of these other things, while other folks will continue enduring intensifying climate impacts. And so in that scenario, greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, and these inequities that are already present just continue to be exacerbated. But I'm really hopeful about this other scenario in which we really reorient our societies around the safety and well-being of every community member, and particularly folks who are most vulnerable to climate impacts. So in that scenario, we're building community-controlled renewable energy, so folks have reliable access to power no matter what, and it's affordable. We are building better public transit so that if folks need to escape and get out of harm's way and they don't have a car, they can still do so. We're making it really easy for folks to weatherize their homes so that they can better regulate temperature and keep smoke and other harmful pollutants out, and also just be more comfortable year-round. We're focusing on land return to Indigenous peoples and removing barriers that sever that traditional ecological knowledge so that some of those ecosystems can return to some level of balance. So all of those things feel really exciting because it's about protecting the safety and well-being of all of our community members. But in the process, we're also reorienting away from fossil fuels. And we're also building communities that are that much more just and equitable and accessible, and also joyful and beautiful and lovely to be in on a day-to-day basis. And so that gets me really excited and hopeful.
Against that backdrop, what compelled you to write this book, and in particular one that centers voices other than your own, which I think is an interesting angle as well?
There have been just an absolute outpouring of incredibly amazing climate books in the past few years, and it's really exciting, and I feel like I can't keep up with all of the amazing new releases. But yeah, as I mentioned, I was really interested in the concept of climate resilience specifically, and I was struggling to find information and conversations happening around that topic that felt like they were approaching climate resilience in a values-aligned way. And so I figured that the best way to kind of dive deeper into the space was to have a whole lot of conversations with folks who are already doing this work on the ground at that intersection between climate justice, mitigation, and adaptation. And so this book was sort of just a natural extension of those conversations and that research. And so similarly, including a lot of different perspectives in this book felt really natural. And I think just the nature of climate resilience is that it requires so many different perspectives and experiences and identities. So it felt important to include many different people. Certainly not enough. And I think one thing that I'm excited about is I'm working on a companion website right now where we'll have more interviews and we'll keep the conversation going, because there are really infinite experiences in this space that are, important to share and listen to. I think it also felt really important to specifically center folks who've been most impacted by the climate crisis and other kind of intertwined social and environmental crises. So for that reason, it felt particularly important to center Black, Indigenous folks, and other people of color, and also to center the experiences of queer and trans folks and disabled folks. And one of the themes of the book is that climate change on a global scale is a new phenomenon, but many communities have endured some version of apocalypse before, and they have found ways to survive and rebuild and heal. And so it makes all of the sense in the world to listen to communities who've, in a sense, been here before. So I was really excited to help uplift some of those stories and some of that wisdom, which I think holds a really precious roadmap that we can use as a guide through this current moment and to bring it into a contemporary context.
As you just mentioned, there are these 39 different voices and stories in the book, which is so rich and so beautiful to read. And I think each person that reads it will be impacted by different stories and different angles and perspectives. So that's a really beautiful gift you're offering. One thing that stood out is that you've chosen not to include any conversations with cisgender men in the book. Could you share more about that decision and, what it meant?
So I think that part of the impetus behind this project was to bring more balance into the conversation. And, as we've discussed, a lot has changed in the past few years since I started working on this. And there have been a lot more amazing books and just larger conversations that are being led by women and gender expansive people of color. But, I think that when I started, and even still, a lot of the climate leaders that get the most airtime are men. And that felt so disconnected from my own experience on the ground and in climate and environmental spaces. And I don't know if you felt this way, but for me, those spaces have overwhelmingly been occupied by women and gender expansive people. So it felt a little bit like, there's like a really stark contrast here. And, I think even more than that, it was the fact that a lot of the climate leaders that folks seemed most plugged into were these ultra wealthy men who kind of came to fame through being the leaders of major tech companies or venture capital firms. And the nature of so many of the mainstream climate conversations really reflected that. And so many of the solutions that society has really latched onto, not coincidentally, are these really technocentric fixes and these market-based solutions that, again, just felt so disconnected from climate justice and environmental justice spaces and those conversations happening on the ground. And I'm a firm believer that we're not going to solve our problems with the same tools and mindsets that got us here in the first place. So I wanted to be really conscious of not just bringing more women, non-binary, two-spirit, and gender expansive voices into the conversation, but also really highlighting folks who were doing things differently, who held different roles, and who perhaps were prioritizing values like interconnectedness and gratitude and humility and care and all of these qualities that we perhaps had not seen so prioritized in some of those dominant climate conversations.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm really glad you took that lens you did in the book. You feel it as you read it. It's a love story.
Yeah, it really is.
And I mean, I know myself going through the book writing experience, it's like a massive personal development furnace. So with that in mind, what changed for you personally writing this book, either for yourself or for your relationship to this topic or anything else that was maybe even unexpected?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I mean, so much, frankly. I think so many of my perspectives have shifted. I think one thing that I can really speak on is that when I started working on this book, I was like really in search of climate strategies that I fully believed in. I feel like I had been in all of these spaces and explored all of these different strategies where I would be so hopeful, and then the wool would be pulled off from my eyes and I'd be like, oh no, it's another marketing ruse. Or, oh no, this is actually doing more harm than good. And so I started the book feeling, I think, a little disillusioned from that perspective. And I ended feeling so incredibly hopeful and passionate about dozens of strategies, which is really special. I think I also left feeling like, oh my gosh, what if these strategies and these leaders and these projects were funded like they should be? I've spent a lot of time in the San Francisco Bay Area in particular, where you see venture capital companies pouring investment into these companies that have some tech element, even though they probably don't need to have a tech element, and they haven't really proven themselves. And they are just, being so heavily invested in the hopes that it becomes a unicorn or they're able to scale substantially. And, in the philanthropy space, it's not all that different. Most of the environmental funding is still being directed towards the same massive old guard environmental organizations. some of which are doing really great work, but also historically, many have undercut grassroots justice movements. And so I think for me, some of this work has just been realizing as a white person with class privilege, I have a responsibility to do what I can to make sure that this amazing grassroots climate work and also grassroots justice and liberation work in other movements is really adequately funded. And in a lot of social movement spaces, there's this saying, fund us like you want us to win, which I feel so deeply. Like so many of these projects could just, oh my goodness, if they were funded like these climate tech companies were, if they were funded like, and it doesn't even need to be at that scale, but they are currently so scrappy and resourceful and so deeply innovative, and they're making it work on these shoestring budgets. So in the past couple of years, I've moved a little more into philanthropy and donor organizing, and that's something that I would love to continue working on and investing in the years to come.
I often think about that too. And I think that's why one of the contributions in your book struck me, which was, I think her name was Morgan Curtis, and she does a lot of work around redirecting resources, overriding intergenerational inequity, and redistributing wealth to grassroots organizations. And that was very interesting to think about that and what it would mean if everybody with those privileges thought and acted in that way.
Absolutely. Yes. Morgan is incredible. She's such an inspiration and role model for me personally. And she has spent so much time and energy in the past few years in community around the concept of reparations and redistribution. And she takes that charge so seriously. So yes, I hope many folks will feel inspired by Morgan's essay.
And with that in mind, what do you hope readers take away from reading the book? What do you hope changes for them?
I think that for one, I hope that people will feel inspired to get involved in some way and see the opportunities to plug into the climate movement as so much more expansive. I hope that folks will see that there are truly infinite climate roles and that a lot of them don't necessarily appear on their face to be climate roles. And a lot of this work can be just kind of a natural extension of what they already do and love and are interested in. And then I hope that readers emerge with a more holistic understanding of the climate crisis, that it's so much more than just greenhouse gas emissions run amok, but that folks feel like they have a better grasp on some of the root causes of the climate crisis and how it intersects with other issues and how it manifests differently for different groups of people. And I hope that gives people a little more confidence in their ability to discern which solutions feel really meaningful, like they're addressing some of the root causes of the crisis, and which might be more harmful or a distraction. Yeah, I hope folks feel like there are so many different ways to weave climate and justice and resilience building work into the roles that they already have.
Yeah, and I think that brings me to this point that you touched on in your book too. I find in my work I get sort of increasingly frustrated when people put themselves into one of two camps. So one camp is, I need to do all the small individual actions that are possible. That's the only way we're going to change. And the other camp that says, none of that matters. If we don't have sustainable systems, we don't have sustainability. And that polarity bothers me because I actually think we need both and they both inform each other. And you spoke about that in your book too. So this myth that we have these two options, individual changes, which can feel futile, or systems changes, which can feel out of reach. What do you see as beyond that binary, and what do you hope people take out of the book to give perhaps some more freedom?
Oh my goodness, yes. I love that you asked this question, and I could not agree more. I think that the systems versus individual change binary is a false binary, and it's ultimately kind of a disempowering one. We don't need to choose. I think the conversation emerged from a really good place. I think there was such a hyper focus on individual behavior changes for so many years. And I think in part we can probably trace that back to fossil fuel companies who were saying, look away, we're not doing anything wrong. Like, look at your carbon footprints. And so I think it was important for people to say, hey, we need to be focusing less on swapping out our light bulbs and more on holding these corporations and governments accountable for their actions or lack thereof. And I think it was also really important for folks to take it a step further and say, actually, the climate crisis is a symptom of growth at all costs capitalism and colonialism and imperialism and all of these other isms. And so we really need to be focusing on decomposing those systems and building new ones and healing from that devastation. But I think that while that narrative shift has been so vital, I think a lot of nuance gets lost in memes and tweets and hot takes on the internet. And this is a space that requires so much nuance and so much expansiveness, because the reality is that systems are made up of individuals. And who is changing these systems if not individuals, or a whole lot of individuals banded together? So a few years ago, when I was really kind of wrestling with this topic, I created this Venn diagram framework kind of for my own purposes. And it's imperfect, but I think helpful in thinking about these different kind of overlapping spheres of change. So I think about the individual level, the interpersonal level, the organizational level, the structural level, the paradigmal or mindset level. And individuals can take action at all of these different levels. So if we're thinking about specifically someone who's interested in strengthening the local food system, at the individual level, that might look like joining a farm share or shopping for food locally or saving their heirloom seeds. And at the interpersonal level, that might look like starting a community garden or swapping food with their neighbors or passing down ancestral food traditions. And at the organizational level, that might look like organizing with others for protections and better wages for farm workers. Or it might look like starting a community agricultural land trust. And at the structure level, it might look like fighting against subsidies for large agribusinesses or streamlining policy to make it a lot easier for small farms and small businesses to thrive. And at the mindset level, it might look like having a lot of conversations around the true value of food and food labor. And these are all kind of actions that individuals can take, right? But they have these incredible ripple effects across all these different spheres. Like, we all have some level of responsibility, and none of us can do everything or do it alone. And so, yeah, I hope that folks feel like really empowered to have influence, but also take some of the pressure off. Like, this isn't on you. This is all hands on deck, generations long work, and no one's going to do it by themselves.
I think that overwhelm piece is a really important one, because the topic itself already feels so overwhelming. And then we can very easily overwhelm ourselves, especially when we think action is necessary across these levels. What helps you deal with that overwhelm? What's helped you in the past, or what's helping you now to stay grounded and not drowning under the overwhelm of it all?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think I'm now living in New York City, where we have, I think, somewhat surprisingly been dealing with wildfire smoke the last few weeks. And I think when climate impacts feel really visceral, even though I'm like in this space every day, when it's so visible, and it can be really hard not to spiral and to kind of get stuck in a doom loop. And so I think for me, I have really been focusing on embracing some of those big feelings and trying not to disconnect or numb from them, which I think is generally my tendency. And I think that's when things tend to go awry, or for so many folks, I think that's when we say, okay, I am jumping out of this movement. It's too much. Or I really don't want to get involved. It's simply too overwhelming. And I totally get that. There's a really great essay in the book by Celine Norgun, who is a somatic coach, and they talk about the importance of really embodying our emotions and growing our capacity for discomfort. And so I'm trying to heed some of that wisdom. And recently, I've actually found a lot of catharsis in movement, and I have recently been going to this like awesome, pretty unstructured communal dance class where I just feel like I can move through so much rage and sadness, but also tap into joy. And I leave feeling so much more clear-headed. Like communities have been using music and movement and other kind of like community tools like that for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so, yeah, I've been part of some like climate grief circles, and that can be really beautiful and helpful as well. But I think for some of us, getting out of our heads and out of like the analysis loop and into our bodies can be really helpful in moving through some of this.
And then also tapping into the wisdom that the body offers as well. We constantly think that it's just our mind that offers wisdom, but the body holds a lot as well. And yeah, when we are engaging with it in that way, I think that's beautiful. And it's so normal, right? Our entire planetary home is under threat. And so, of course, we're going to feel sadness and anger and grief. And the challenge is if we block that off, then we block off our ability to access any of those other emotions too, like joy and hope that can actually also fuel our actions and maybe fuel them in a more sustainable way. So, yeah, that really resonates. I strongly agree with the somatic tools as an important part of the toolbox in this process.
And for folks who are kind of similarly feeling the overwhelm, I think that is such an important message to reiterate. You are not alone, and this is a super valid, normal response to what's happening, which is threatening. And so, like, being able to tune into that reaction, I think, is really important.
Yeah, it's a normal part of being a feeling alive human on the planet in the situation we're in right now.
Yes.
I wanted to ask about climate leadership. So another nice theme in your book is that a lot of the kind of mainstream climate solutions, you talked a lot about the tech-oriented ones, aren't really working in the way we need them to. And it's time for a new era of not only solutions, but also climate leadership. So what is the new type of leadership you hope to see, and what visions or snippets of it did you take out of your book writing process or from the people you spoke to as a part of the book writing process?
I think there's a whole lot of wisdom on this topic throughout the book, so I will only be able to touch on sort of the tip of the iceberg. But I think one thing that comes to mind is humility. I think that the climate crisis was caused in part by hubris. So really appropriately valuing humility, I think, is going to be really important to navigate this moment. But also, a lot of this work is uncharted territory. So it's par for the course that we're going to make a lot of mistakes and hit dead ends and have to be re-strategizing and reoriented constantly. And I think one of the things that I was most impressed by in so many of my conversations with these climate leaders is that they are super reflective and transparent about when things don't go as planned or when there are mistakes. And they're not afraid to talk about that and learn from those mistakes, to ask for help, to lean on others for support and guidance, and to really respect and defer to the wisdom as well of plants and animals and ancestors and these ecosystems that have been functioning for millennia. So I think that having both humility and courage in this moment is really important. I would also say that we simply need more types of leaders. So as we mentioned, we have seen kind of a few different types of leaders get most airtime in dominant climate conversations. But in this book, there are healers and grief workers and facilitators and artists and storytellers and earth workers and mothers and organizers. And this movement requires all of those roles and more. It really just requires a diversity of tactics and perspectives. And so I think part of this is just shifting our idea of what leadership looks like and who leaders are and what roles they should fill. So yeah, I think part of this journey for me has been developing just a much more expansive conception of climate leadership. And then I also am constantly in awe of folks who are walking this tightrope of, on the one hand, balancing the fact that the climate crisis is so urgent, that this is time-sensitive work. And on the other hand, kind of going at the speed of trust and prioritizing relationship building and rest and joy and ease and modeling in their work the type of world that they're trying to build. And my gosh, that is so very hard to do, again, due to the nature of this work. But we're not going to be arriving at one moment suddenly where we've solved the climate crisis and it's over. And so now is the time, I think, to begin modeling the type of world that we're trying to build.
I couldn't agree with that more. I think you really feel that integrity and that integration when you're in spaces where people are in that moment modeling the vision of the future that they want to see. It's so rare, but when you do feel it, it's really amazing. I like to finish every episode with a question: what living a great and full life means to you.
That's a great question. I think that it probably is not dissimilar to what I kind of just described as what I admire so much in wonderful climate leaders is I think it looks like balancing what I feel is purpose and responsibility to my beloveds, to my ancestors, to hopefully my future descendants, with a life that is full of connection and joy and silliness and pleasure and rest and great food. So I think it feels like, that balance, which I know for me will be a lifelong journey, a lifelong push and pull.
Oh, that's beautiful for all of us. And that's, I guess, that's the dance that life asks us to do. Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate all the effort and sweat and tears that no doubt went into the whole book writing process. So thank you for doing that and lifting up these really important voices that people need to hear. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Grateful Podcast. It's been so great to have you here. This is actually the third season of the podcast, and we're now going to start collecting guests and insights and topics for season 4. So if you have any ideas at all, please feel free to email them to me at podcast@thegrateful.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, it would mean so much to us if you could drop us a rating or leave a review wherever you're listening to your podcasts. Thanks for listening today, and see you next time.